because you might be looking at your smartphone app and you may not see on the Weather Channel app, oh, we're going to have an inversion. You may not see that, but you may see calm weather conditions, and obviously a very potentially high-risk situation. It was quite warm the prior week. Again, I went back and I looked at all the weather records. It was actually exactly 10 degrees warmer on the average day, and I think that that week before August 15th, the high temperature that week had been about 87 degrees. So for the middle part of August, pretty warm. And as Becky talked about, the temperature factor is a big deal. The last known contact with Mike was just a little bit after 4 o'clock in the morning. I think he sent a Snapchat message to some of his friends showing what he was going to be doing that morning, and then he was found a couple of hours later dead because of hydrogen sulfide exposure. One of the things I want to just really quickly point out, is Coroner Rifleman here by any chance? I've not met him in person, but we've sent a lot of emails back and forth. The original report in the newspaper was methane, and we did definitely encourage the follow-up with hydrogen sulfide. From my experience and having worked in this area now for about 30 years, it's really common. The first diagnosis is methane, and we always encourage the coroners to go back and at least look at hydrogen sulfide, and almost always that has been the case. So I want to broaden your perspective just a little bit. So this obviously tragic. Again, I've talked about how I've been working in this area now for actually about 32, 33 years. Agricultural safety and health. Agriculture is, in fact, a very dangerous occupation. I don't want to dwell on this in a great amount of detail, but our death rate in agriculture, that's the number of deaths up at the top, the number of deaths, 20.4 per 100,000 workers. We are a very dangerous occupation. We've been at the top of that bar chart throughout my career, again, for about 32 years or so. That translates into about 450 fatalities a year, about 120,000 serious events or medically consulted injuries. The one positive is I want to say we've reduced that death rate significantly. I started in 1985. The death rate at that time was not 20, it was up by actually closer to 60. So we have made progress, and a big part of that is through awareness, through education, and through programs like this one here today. Just again, I don't want to dwell on this. Tractor overturns, power takeoff entanglements, large animal injuries and fatalities are quite common. A lot of injuries, I use a term here, my dad. My dad's a farmer. He actually retired a couple years ago, but he still drives a fertilizer truck. And my dad oftentimes talks about just going out and mucking around. So a lot of these injuries and fatalities happen in really unusual circumstances. People are just out doing their work, and it's nothing real like glamorous. You know, when somebody gets wrapped up in a power takeoff shaft, it's really dramatic and it draws a lot of attention. But a lot of these are falls and, you know, falling off of a grain bin or a tower silo, and they don't attract the kind of attention that this particular incident got. Manure incidents and other confined space fatalities in Wisconsin only make up about 4% of our deaths. So what we're talking about there, we have typically between 20 and 30 deaths in the state of Wisconsin on farms as a result of occupational injuries, and only 4%, and that includes all confined spaces. Some of the other things, we know augers on an hour-for-hour basis, very dangerous. We don't use them that many hours in the year, but they're quite dangerous. They result in really gruesome types of injuries. The result is often fractures, lacerations, spinal cord injuries. Farmers also have the highest rate of occupational disability and things like arthritis. So a lot of dairy farmers who end up either getting out of business or convert over to a more modern parlor system, the last 20 years it's been because of occupational ergonomics and those kinds of things with knee arthritis, etc. But I want to stick mainly to manure, and I want to stick mainly to things like confined spaces. Why was this one so unusual? Again, it was so unusual because when we learned about this on August 16th, the day after, we had not, I shouldn't say we, I had never seen in the state of Wisconsin, and I also worked in Minnesota for 18 years. I had never seen a totally outdoor, non-enclosed fatality as a result of manure gas exposure, specifically hydrogen sulfide. Had just never seen it. Pennsylvania, we did find out after the fact. I was not fully aware of this, but Pennsylvania had identified some incidents involving people and animals. I think you're going to hear from Stephanie after lunch. I know Iowa has observed some cases probably involving animals, maybe some close calls with people. But I had, again, personally had never seen this. We always talk about confined spaces, but we've never really looked at this outdoor environment. Pennsylvania, just like we are, after this case, are also very interested in this outdoor hydrogen sulfide situation, particularly in light of some of the additional sulfur that is going into this environment through feed, through distillers products. I think you guys were feeding distiller syrup, a very high sulfur concentration. And again, a lot of that work that was done out in Pennsylvania was involving or involved the use of gypsum bedding, which is what Becky also talked about. I want to talk a little bit more about this confined space situation, because I know a lot of you are pumpers and haulers and you are maybe dealing with confined spaces. We have done a lot of work in agricultural confined spaces over the last 20 to 30 years. In fact, I'm actually part of a national group. It was before Mike's death in August. We were together in Washington, D.C., finalizing our national education, research, and extension agenda for confined spaces, with manure pits and other confined spaces being a big part. Let me just ask you guys a question, get a little bit of audience interaction. Where do we see confined spaces on farms? Silos? Okay, which kind of silos? Yeah, all of them. They can be the old, stave or concrete tower silos. They can obviously be the oxygen-limited silos. And to some extent, depending on the configuration, one of the definitions of a confined space is something that is difficult to get into or out of. Even a bunker or like a pit or trench silo could be considered a confined space as well. The other big one is grain bins. If you look at the rate of fatalities, or the number, this is actually just the number of fatalities in confined spaces over the last, since 1962, so from 2015 going back to 1964, we see this kind of gradual increase, and a lot of it is because we're seeing a lot more grain stored on farms. We're seeing a lot more forage and silage on individual farms, so there is a fair amount of additional exposure. And then I also wanted to just show you this before I go back into the manure situation. About 143 of the total is up in the upper right-hand corner, 1,873, only 143 are from manure storage facilities. So I just want to kind of put this into a little bit of perspective. We're talking today exclusively about manure, but I want you to get this bigger picture that when you're out there farming and you're working in agriculture, whether you're a commercial service person or an individual producer, there are some other risks that we also need to pay attention to. Here in Wisconsin, over that time period from 64 to 2015, you might not be able to see this, we have documented 130 confined space fatalities and 6 just in the year 2015. Now again, remember that this is only on the average 0.4% of what we've been looking at. Let me go back specifically and talk about manure. In my 32 years, we've looked at a lot of different situations. I also worked in the insurance industry. I worked for, at that time, we were the country's biggest agricultural insurer. We're the Illinois Farm Bureau, and we bought out companies in Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Alaska, Arkansas. And at that time, we were doing a lot of work in this area. The big thing we were concerned about was insuring these facilities. In Illinois in particular, with the big hog operations, we were quite concerned about the potential for liability, the potential for workers' compensation claims and that kind of thing. And then the other thing is, when we bought the insurance company in Washington State was one of the big leaders, along with California, at going to the really, really large dairy facilities. So we were looking out there as well. One of the things we have seen, and this one I think is actually from the state of Virginia, back in 2007, there was a manure fatality that involved 5 individuals, typically one person going in, and then people who were either family members or others who were attempting a rescue. We actually, I don't know if you guys know this, but we had a 5 fatality incident here in Wisconsin back in 1989. So this is, again, this is not new stuff. I investigated out on the site. We went out in 1992 to 2 double fatalities. They happened, I think they actually occurred on the same day, but we went out a couple weeks after that. These were both, well, one was in a dairy cattle facility, the other one was a swine farm. And in both cases, one person went down to perform a service-related activity. That person went down face first. One was an underground or under the building pit, and the other one was kind of a center between buildings, like a reception pit. And that person went down as about a 4-foot diameter manhole. In both cases, the first person went down face down. In the Dakota County situation, there was a helper, and he decided not to go down. You might wonder, why did he know not to go down? The first worker was totally unaware. The second worker decided not to go down in after him because he had been at a workshop years before where there was a presentation called Dangers in the Air when Handling Livestock, and he knew not to go down in. However, he ran and got the victim's uncle, and the uncle just panicked and freaked out, and he went down, and we had a double fatality there as well. One thing I want to point out about that case is we were out 2 weeks after. We went down into that reception pit with a big, literally like a canoe paddle. We paddled around, we dropped monitors down in there. There had been no additional rainfall or anything like that, but it was a lot cooler. And even though we had a sensor right on the top surface of that liquid, we dropped it down with a probe, we could measure 0 parts per million. So these incidents or these environments do change very rapidly. And it's like what Becky showed in her graph. It can go from 0 to 500. And by the way, 500 is a big deal. 500, you get between 500 and 700. And a couple of breaths, it paralyzes your muscles that control your breathing. So it's scary. It's a scary gas, and it's something we really need to watch out for. A few common denominators. When these incidents occur, like I said, the guy in Dakota County, the family in Michigan, there often is a complete lack of awareness. You interview family members who survived afterwards, and they had no idea that this was a potential risk. I have also never seen a case where a person goes down in a death situation where there was any type of monitoring or where the person was using some type of a breathing apparatus that provided fresh air, and or where they were providing any sort of special, extraordinary means to over-ventilate the system. It's usually, any one of those, the fact that we've never seen it with any one of those suggests to me that those are all protective, and especially if used in combination. Multiple events are not uncommon. Again, these 3, 4, 5. Those that are first on the scene often struggle to respond. I want to just put a little bit of a plea out to all you guys. So when I say the first on the scene, I'm often talking about not the uncle who went in to get his nephew. I'm talking about fire departments and rescue squads and people who work for the emergency medical services. They get out there and they might know, oh, we've got an O2 monitor. We can measure for oxygen. Is that going to be enough? Could it have been something other than oxygen? And sometimes it might take them a few minutes to decide what they're going to do. If it's a fire department, they're going to put on an air pack and then go down and retrieve the person. And that, 2 or 3 minutes that it takes to get it out of the truck and get down in there can be the difference between life and death. So we've done a lot of work over the years in terms of preparing our emergency medical service people, our fire departments, our EMTs, our paramedics. And I think even more of this kind of work is needed in the future. The other thing I want to mention is all the events that I have looked at very closely. I've looked at a lot of them on paper, but the ones where I've been out to the scene, it has always been followed by this relatively hot period. In 1992, I'm sure none of you guys remember, none of you probably remember this, but 1992 we lived up in Minnesota. We just moved up there. It's a really cool summer. We couldn't go swimming or fishing for half the summer. But in that middle part or that very early part of August, it got super hot. It actually pushed up into the upper 90s and even low hundreds. And then that death occurred a week after, not dissimilar to the situation here in Portage County. Again, I wanted to just make sure you were aware that we've got this one-page piece that's been prepared for the family, and also the piece that we've got from Penn State that is available with quite a bit more information on safety. So, and by the way, I don't think I mentioned this. Ken, the safety part of the presentation I was going to cover. I'm on the program, but then Cheryl Skolas was going to talk about monitoring. And we actually flipped the order. For those of you who know Cheryl, how many of you know Cheryl Skolas? Yeah, Cheryl is she's probably one of our most dependable people in the department, and she felt really bad about not being able to be here, but we encouraged her. Her father, I think, had a fall accident several days ago and is just being released from the hospital today. So Becky and I figured we could probably cover. But what I'm going to talk about with monitoring was the piece that Cheryl was going to cover. I've just kind of flipped the order a little bit. But before I go to monitoring, does anybody have any kind of questions about the bigger picture on safety and best practices and some of those kinds of things? This is also a clever way to give myself a little bit of a breathing break here. Yeah.
You talked earlier about more than one person being overcome by toxic or deadly gases or situation. Is there a percentage that you found that with regards to confined space maybe, because that stuff's tracked?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The question again is there a percentage, how many of these are multiple fatalities? And I know that that information does exist. The green cover of that booklet that I showed, that's actually online, and I know that that information is in there. You know?
It's about 70%.
70%, okay. Yeah, and then, let me say one other quick thing, and this is probably also right in your wheelhouse. Agriculture is not the only industry that deals with hydrogen sulfide. Anybody that's dealing with like petroleum processing, any type, I think Becky also mentioned this, any place where you're dealing with high levels of organic material that's being degraded by anaerobic bacteria. So that would include like municipal waste treatment facilities. I don't know if any of you also go out and pump on-site septic systems. You know, you go up to any of our, well, probably on your farm, you've got an on-site system that you pump out periodically. You often don't have to go physically into those, but those would certainly be considered a high potential risk for hydrogen sulfide. Thank you for helping me out. Any other quick questions on safety? I have about an equal amount of material, maybe a little bit more on monitoring. Let's transition to monitoring. I do have a caveat before we go into this, and I know you guys are all probably the majority of you are here. I know at least some of our vendors are here because of the monitoring question. Monitoring by itself, without thinking about the bigger picture and context, it's not a magic bullet. And I want to try to put some of the monitoring questions in that context. Like, how does it have to fit with part of an overall strategy? And in my work, again, 30-some years doing this kind of work, I've done a lot of work with students and professionals. I've been up in front of juries and judges in courtrooms. And I always talk about something called the safety hierarchy. And basically the safety hierarchy says that the best way to deal with some of these kinds of issues that happen, if it is at all possible, to minimize or get rid of the hazard. So again, I think about if we have a big problem now with a lot of sulfur in diets, maybe that's one thing that we need to look at, to somehow change the system to somehow eliminate the hazard. We often talk about if that doesn't work, that's the most effective way to deal with an issue. If that doesn't work, then we kind of drop down on the hierarchy. We say we're going to put on, we're going to put a fence around a basin. We're going to employ a monitor so that we make sure that we're taking care to monitor that breathing space. The next layer in the hierarchy is to provide warnings and instructions. What's the problem with warnings and instructions? What?
Ignored.
They're ignored. I mean, you've all got warnings and instructions on all your farm machinery or on your trucks and your pumping equipment and agitation equipment. I've got them all over the Ford Focus on my, pull down my visor. How often do I look at those? Not very often. And so warnings and labels and things like that tend not to be very effective, but they are very necessary because you've got to provide that baseline level of information. And then training. And again, training assumes people are going to learn the information, they're going to follow the instructions. And the last thing is, okay, if you've got a gas level of hydrogen sulfide and you can't get rid of this hazard and you can't employ safeguarding technologies, then you put on a piece of personal protective equipment. Again, people, they don't use it correctly, or they decide for this one time, I'm not going to use it, I'm not going to wear the earplugs or the mask or whatever it might be. So that's why personal protective equipment is down there at the bottom. I want to just, again, caution you, this whole monitor thing is not the magic bullet. If there are ways that we can get rid of this hazard or eliminate it or reduce the amount of exposure, that's greatly preferred. If pumping and work is going to, so here's some things we know. If pumping and work is going to happen close to an outdoor liquid manure storage facility, and that includes liquid that is now crusted on the top, if that work is going to happen in zero or low wind conditions, that is a high hazard exposure. So immediately you're not able to eliminate the hazard because you're like, there's no wind, you've got a problem. And I would not want to be working, monitor or no monitor, I would not want to be working in that kind of a situation. And that is what is recommended in your handout. By pumping in a high hazard potential situation and relying on other safety hierarchy methods, risks, it's going to increase. There's going to always be that probability, that high probability of a death or a close call. And in addition, we're concerned about the high sulfur. I want to apply this a little bit back to the confined spaces, because how many of you guys that are pumpers and haulers and farmers, how many of you do occasionally need to work in or around a confined space?
What's the definition of a confined space?
So the definition of confined space is a worker can enter to perform work and or limited means of getting in or getting out, and then not designed for continuous occupants. And in an agricultural situation, you've got gases, potential for oxygen displacement. I'm guessing probably more of you are actually doing this than raise your hand. We typically recommend in a confined space situation not going in whenever possible. That's the safety hierarchy. That's eliminating the hazard. For farmers, producers, whether you're beef, dairy, pork, poultry, we do often recommend transferring the risk from one group of people to another. That's called, in insurance, we call this risk transfer. So that's why a lot of you probably are hiring a contractor to come out and do your pumping and hauling. It's probably also because of the equipment needs. But that's a really common thing now in agriculture is we transfer risks over to somebody who's better equipped, that can spread the cost of safety equipment across a larger set of businesses and operations. We also recommend in confined spaces maximizing ventilation, continuous air monitoring, working in a team setting, multiple people, and that includes having people go into a confined space with some type of a lifeline, a harness, and a retrieval device. And then also, we need to have access in a confined space where you cannot verify the quality of the air continuously. We also strongly urge self-contained breathing apparatus. Again, I'll come back to the outdoor situation in a second. This applies indoor, outdoor, whatever. With manure, the typical respirator that you might go down here to Stevens Point and buy at the Fleet Farm, the typical cartridge respirator, dust mask, that sort of thing, an air purifying respirator provides, and Stephanie, you can correct me on this, provides zero protection. If you get into 50 or especially over 100 parts per million of hydrogen sulfide, it provides zero protection. And there's also a whole bunch of other considerations. If you've got workers, if you're a service contractor, there are a whole bunch of other things with respirators, fit testing, medical monitoring. If you've got beard, facial hair, mustache, sideburns, your beard, your facial hair will filter out the big chunks, but all the gas stuff is going to go right around the facial hair. I just really want to emphasize this because I've gone out onto scenes and sites before, manure storage, anhydrous ammonia, and people are wearing a mask that's probably not providing them with a lot of protection. In fact, it might be providing them with a false sense of security. Don't want to go into a lot of detail about self-contained breathing apparatus. This is the only thing that works. When you talk about those levels, 100 parts per million plus hydrogen sulfide or a lack of oxygen, this is the only thing you can use. A full, like an air pack, like a fire department might have. And again, if I'm doing this kind of work on a commercial basis, I'll talk about this in a few minutes. If I've got guys that are out pumping, men or women that are out pumping on a daily or a weekly basis, you might want to think about some form of a supplied air respirator being accessible and available in case something does happen. So on monitors, okay, I'm going to maybe be a little bit controversial, and the vendors can challenge me or correct me on this. I believe that monitors for manure gases really only should be thought of as a no hazard verification tool. And when I say no hazard, it's going to be normal when you're working around, you're pumping, you're agitating, or you're spreading out in the field. You might very commonly see levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parts per million. That to me is not high hazard. You get up over 10, then you start looking at OSHA issues. You get up over 20, and we get into Becky's short-term exposure limits. But to me, that baseline, that background level, that's not what I'm talking about with no hazard. But if I'm out there and these are not designed to skate on the edge of the ice. I don't know if that makes sense or not. So if you're out there like, okay, my short-term exposure limit is 20, and I know that it's immediately dangerous to life and health at 100, well, shoot, I'm only here at like 75, I'm just going to keep watching and listening to this monitor. To me, that's very dangerous. And again, you guys can disagree with me on this. Again, it goes back to the safety hierarchy. If you can get rid of the hazard and try to stay out of the hazard entirely, in the outdoor situation, again, I think wind is the biggest one. But it should not be designed as a tool. They are not perfect technology, and I know you guys will agree with me on that. They're not a perfect technology. The other thing that I worry about, and again, I've been involved with lots of legal and litigation cases with courtrooms, etc. We do have to, not with gas monitors, but with other types of safety technologies, we need to watch for the issue of dependency. So if I think I can skate on the edge of the ice, and I'm out there and I'm looking, 20, 25, 30, and my thing's going off, and I like shut it down or whatever because it's annoying, and suddenly the wind kicks a different direction and I'm in a cloud of 500, that's a big problem. And that's what I'm talking about with user dependency, luring people in with a false sense of security. So you guys are going to see a lot of monitor stuff after lunch. There's lots of considerations. First of all, the cost, the initial kind of startup cost is a big deal. But you also have to think about ongoing service and calibration. So I would suggest that we're looking at a range of, from a simple, a little bit hesitant to hold up all the equipment, but I will hold this up and I'll pass it around. I need to make sure I get this back. A simple one gas, a single gas, this is for hydrogen sulfide, about $130 to $150, a real basic. The problem, single gas, what's the problem with only looking at hydrogen sulfide?
You're not looking at methane or oxygen content.
And I'm especially concerned about oxygen content because, and especially in a confined space. So this could work for you if you're working at the edge of your basin, you're pumping, you got decent wind. This could work to help you verify that you're in a very low or no hazard situation. You would never want to use this in a confined space. The other problem with this monitor is if you're using it in a confined space, you might have no oxygen or you might have a very limited amount of oxygen in that confined space. This isn't going to tell you that. And not only that, these monitors need a little bit of oxygen to be able to operate correctly. And you might get an artificially low reading. So not only do you have a lack of oxygen, but you might get an incorrect kind of like doubling up on your risk. So I'm going to pass this around. I will, just a little bit of a warning to you all, if you turn it on, you're welcome to do so, but it's going to make quite a little bit of commotion, and then that will be your embarrassment, not mine, okay? I think I actually skipped, yeah, and then let me pass this around as well. This is a 4-gas monitor. I think, Carmen, you might be talking about the 4 and 5 gas monitors. This one is from a company called MSA. I think it used to be called Mine Safety Appliances, is that right? Yeah, so this is what we're talking about with a 4-gas monitor. Again, this would do the oxygen, the hydrogen sulfide, and you can change that sensor out for another one, I believe. You can, and it also will look at combustibles, like Becky talked about blowing up barns. That would be methane in particular. And then typically that 4th gas, you could add in a sensor for carbon monoxide. Anybody know why you'd want to look at carbon monoxide in an ag situation? Yeah, vehicles, a gas-powered pressure washer inside of a building or in a generator, things like that. And then the other thing, I think you can put a nitrogen dioxide sensor. Is that right, Jim? Yeah. Nitrogen dioxide is silo gas. So silo gas that could come out of a tower silo or a bunker or trench.
Diesel engines, so any tractor.
Okay.
Gases, carbon monoxide, and nitrogen dioxide.
Thank you. As the 4-gas comes around, I'll double up on my warning on this one, because if you push the button on this one will go through all kinds of setups and noises and alarms, and then everybody will turn and look at you. So. A few other things about the gas monitors. Again, we talked about gases and conditions monitored. The more expensive, this particular one coming around, the 4-gas MSA, a little over $2,000. Now again, that's only the cost for the unit. Then we're also looking at calibration. There's charging, docking stations, things like that. And again, I'll let those guys talk a little bit more about that. It's typically worn on a person. These monitors are often worn on a person. You obviously don't want to wear the one that looks like a traffic cone up here. That's made for a fixed location. I think Jim will talk about that after lunch. Again, you can store data in the more expensive units. The little bitty ones, there's no ability to store or retrieve data. Is that not true? Including this little one I've got?
Well, your device. No,
my device, okay. Your device, yes, okay. So some of the smaller ones. And actually some of the smaller ones now, Jim was telling me you can interface with all different types of other devices. So battery life, you got to look at battery life. If you're only going to go out and be able to use it for a couple, 3, 4 hours, that's not positive, although that's pretty untypical. Sensor flexibility and interchangeability, obviously with the 1-gas monitor, you're not going to be able to exchange out sensors, and also the training that's required, including some of the stuff that I've talked about here today as well as Becky. Don't just send a monitor, whether it's a 1-gas, 4-gas, 5-gas, just don't send it out with a person and expect that they're going to be protected. I want to give you a little bit of a caution here. You can go on to Amazon. You can buy monitors. One of the things I've found here, very little information. You don't have the benefits of a local service provider, somebody who can help you with technical support, training, who can advise you on calibration. You might be able to save $100 on one of these units, but I would suggest if you're going to go into this whole world, you need to get in with a good dealer, a reputable dealer who can provide that type of background support. And these guys did not pay me to say that. I truly do believe that because I've seen people buy them and then they have not a clue how to use it. And again, the problem with that is you might give somebody a false sense of security. I have nothing against Amazon because it's equally good product, although this one is only a couple stars. I think the BW product is actually affiliated with Honeywell. Is that right? Again, another example of the single gas monitors. You can get them for hydrogen sulfide, oxygen. Actually, there's a lot of different types and categories of single gas monitors. Diane, this goes back to one of the other questions. The 4-gas monitors, we're typically looking in that sort of $550, probably that's pretty cheap, up to $2,500 and higher, depending on the features. The single gas monitors around $130, $150, maybe $200, depending on the communications, the data storage abilities, those kinds of things. Some additional considerations, the 4-gas monitor that's coming around, you'll notice on the back there's a little port. That thing is designed to pump air or actively bring in air. The 1-gas monitor is a diffusion monitor. It relies on people being in a high enough concentration and that gas diffusing into the sensor. That's a problem, or that's a potential concern. I think you asked me if I talk about bump testing. I want to talk a little bit about calibration and bump testing. Calibration is very important. It's very critical, actually. And again, one of the ideas of getting hooked up with a service representative is oftentimes they can help you, for a cost, provide the calibration services and support. It is also required with many types of monitors that you occasionally bump, not occasionally, but before most uses.
OSHA says prior to each use, you're supposed to function test the device. So I got a great definition to help you along with that.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jim Moody. I'm with Industrial Scientific. We manufacture gas detectors. I do these types of talks all the time. But when I talk about bump testing, I ask people, what do you do when you pick up a flashlight? It's not a trick question. What do you do? Turn it on, right? Why do you turn it on? The reason you turn it on is you're verifying that the total device is going to work. So you're checking the battery, the bulb, the switch, all those subcomponents of a device. The industry term called bump testing is forcing concentrations of gas onto that device that'll drive every single sensor into that device into alarm or make it cause a reaction. You're testing the board, the battery, the audible visual vibrating alarms, the sensors, basically every subcomponent in that device, you're verifying that it works. The only way you can do that is supply those target gases to that device. So that's what a bump test is. So OSHA says it's supposed to be done prior to each day's use unless the manufacturer has written that it doesn't need to be. Okay? So it becomes important when you consider liability if you own a pumper company, for example, and you go, hey, I'm not going to have my guys bump test. Well, one of your employees gets injured on the job, you're criminally liable now. It's not just, you're criminally negligent, so you can go to jail for that.
Yeah, and Jim, you can say that whether or not OSHA actually applies to an individual operator, because if you're a farmer, you go below 11 employees. However, in a courtroom, in a litigation situation, if you weren't following the industry practices, and the bump test on a single gas monitor, what would a bump test kit cost on that?
Typical bottle, I'll use H2S as an example, about $175 MSRP. Plus a manual flow regulator, talk about $150, maybe a little bit less. You're spending $300.
$300 to $400
on the individual setup plus the cost of the instrument. And then guess what? That bottle of H2S is like a gallon of milk. It expires. Yeah. And when it expires, the variance in what the manufacturer says on the label versus what's really in the bottle gets all out of whack. So you can't use expired gas either. If you were to get audited, you could get fined for that as well, or you could be held criminally negligent if you were to get audited for that.
Yeah, so we just want to get this out there that, yeah, you can buy something for 130 bucks. You know, the single one gas monitor, you might be able to get by with purchasing something off Amazon, but then there are some other additional sort of annual maintenance with the calibration, depending on how frequently you use it, and then also the every use bump test. Again, there's lots of examples out there. I want to kind of begin to wrap up here, and then we'll take questions and things. I've thought a lot about this after Mike passed away in August, and I've thought, okay, if I'm a farmer, my dad no longer operates the farm, but he does, you know, he's dealing with anhydrous and a lot of hauling fertilizer and seed and stuff like that. So he's not exposed to a lot of manure gases. But when I was a kid growing up, what would I want based on what I know now if I'm a farmer? I think if I'm dealing with only outdoor storage, and I'm assuming that I'm never going to pump or agitate in a zero wind condition, I think at a minimum I would definitely want to have my hands on some type of a single gas unit. That is going to absolutely assume that I'm always going to have adequate oxygen in an outdoor situation. I don't see that as being overly risky. I'm still a pretty conservative guy. But realize in having that, it's going to have a relatively short lifespan. So if I'm really doing a lot of work, I'll probably be replacing this thing every 1 to 2 years. The cheap one, the 130 that I would probably go for, I'm not going to be able to log data. I'm not going to have a lot of adjustments. It's going to give me a low alarm condition and a high alarm condition. Pretty simple, but they're also pretty reliable. These things are pretty dependable. They don't work instantaneously. They're not pumping. You're not pumping. You're not drawing air into it as you would with the 4-gas. It's relying on diffusion. You might have a lag time, right, of 10, 20, 30 seconds or more.
I'm going to disagree with you a little bit.
Okay.
With pumped instruments and versus diffusion or non-pumped instruments. The pump on a gas detector is made to simulate diffusion conditions, but what it does is just drawing atmosphere at a distance.
Into the diffusion sensor.
It's into the diffusion chamber. So you're really not, if you had a vessel and you put a diffusion instrument and a pumped instrument in that vessel at the same time, and the vessel's filled with gas, they're going to read the same thing at the same
At the same time, okay.
Yeah, you're not going to get any difference in that because the pumped instrument is made to simulate the instrument being in diffusion mode, because if you overpressurize it, the sensors won't.
Got it. And Jim, I'm also assuming these are not instantaneous instruments, right?
There's what's called T90 and T60 response times. So each manufacturer has to, as part of their certifications when they build these devices, register with UL, Underwriters Laboratory, how fast the sensor will respond. Typically, a 90% response is 15 seconds or less on an H2S sensor, but every sensor is slightly different, and every manufacturer is slightly different. And so it's like, you know, hey, we're all human beings, but I'm definitely a lot shorter than a lot of folks here, right? That was a joke. Thank you. But yeah, so every sensor operates differently, right? And every manufacturer is not created equal, at least as far as I'm concerned, but they're all designed to work with safety in mind, and they all have a reasonable degree of variance.
But let's just say that it is 10 to 15 seconds. If you time yourself sometime, you can walk a pretty good distance in 10 seconds. And realizing that if you are using it to try to figure out what do I have out there, the University of Iowa actually has a really good publication that shows how you might put something like a probe at the end of a piece of PVC pipe and be able to probe. But if you're walking around at normal speed and you're probing, you're not giving that sensor enough time. So what we're talking about when you're monitoring for the first time is doing it extremely deliberately, almost uncomfortably slow as you move from spot to spot to make sure you're getting the type of measurement, right? Because you could go from 5 to 500 or 5 to 50.
The wand you have in front of you there is roughly, what, 7 feet?
Yeah, probably.
In gas detection, the
Oh,
industry
we'll
is
pass
called
this
a
around,
2x2
too.
sampling rule. It says for every foot of travel, it's a 10-foot one. So
That's a 10?
every 2 foot of line that you have, attached to your instrument, you got to wait, every foot of line attached to your instrument that you have, you got to wait 2 seconds for the gas to travel through that foot of line. And then to get a truly full response as to what that sensor is going to show you, you're supposed to wait a full 2 minutes. You'll get most of it within 15 seconds. You'll get 90% of it within 15 seconds. But if you really want to know what's there, you're supposed to wait a full 2 minutes. So 2 minutes and 20 seconds at every sample point you take.
So when I was a student and we were doing some of this work at Purdue, like we were watching the industrial hygienist, and he was literally, like you could hardly see his feet moving, and it was, why are you doing that? It's because of this phenomenon that we're talking about. I'm not going to go into this, other than to say that the way that these things work, it's a pretty simple chemical reaction. They're robust. Hydrogen sulfide sensors have been around for several decades. It's not, there's a lot of internal circuitry that's different.
1980s.
Okay.
1980s technology was developed. It's gotten smaller and faster over time, but at the end of the day, it's not like going from your house phone to a cell phone. Right.
And the circuitry in these little units, that has changed pretty dramatically with Bluetooth and other kinds of capabilities. If I was in a commercial service business, I'm gonna invest. If I'm a pumper, if I'm working with people or working with manure on a daily or a weekly basis, I would want to go toward the higher end gas monitor with the calibration gear, with the bump testing equipment. I could send this thing off to be calibrated in a service facility and sent back probably anywhere between $75 and $200 per unit, depending on one sensor. Is that correct?
Yeah, a typical calibrate, a manufacturer will, if you're going to send it into a manufacturer or even a distributor. Carmen, what do you guys charge for a cal?
Well, you had a single sensor unit that's calibrated, not inspected or anything. You're looking at $100.
Yeah.
Right. If you send it into my factory direct or through a distributor, I think our base rate is about $150 for a calibration and an inspection. The problem with that is you're not following OSHA's recommendations with that. You're probably doing that once every 6 months or once a quarter. There's tools that are available out there.
Or once, some guys once a year.
Or
yeah.
once a year.
Yeah.
There's tools out there called a docking station that if you spend more money up front, you save more money on the back end. So it's kind of.
And I think you guys are going to show some of those stations. Is that correct? Yeah. But again, I'd go after the more expensive unit. Again, if I'm doing this on a daily basis, I really do think you have to look. If you're going into confined spaces, if that's part of the work you're doing, I think you really need to have self-contained breathing apparatus. And I think you need the training and the fit testing and all the stuff that goes along with that. And it needs to be used as part of a larger, more sophisticated confined space entry program. Appropriate ventilation, retrieval equipment. I've done a couple papers where we looked at costing this out over the course of, say, a 5-year working life. So we're starting to talk about bigger bucks here, but again, when we talk about the consequences, it's important. And I would want to invest more in worker education and hands-on training. We did, in Minnesota, we did actually several sessions around the state of Minnesota where we did full multi-day confined space entry training for people that were doing manure pit and any sort of concrete structure or slurry store, doing actual hands-on training with SCBA, et cetera. At the higher price points, I've already talked about some of these. Considerably longer life, batteries, better ability to capture data, more controls, adjustments. Some of these monitors have no motion alarms, so that if a worker goes down, it'll provide an alarm. But again, just the last couple slides here, we have to be careful that we don't introduce people into an inadvertently high-risk situation. A monitor that's used incorrectly or hasn't been bump tested or calibrated, getting themselves too far into an unsafe situation. So I'm wearing a monitor and I go from 0 to 20 and all of a sudden I'm in 500. I might not be able to back out quickly enough. I really am concerned about that, which is a bigger risk factor with the no air, no wind movement. Or the incorrect use of an air pack, or asking older workers. So if you have self-contained breathing apparatus and you're not working with a qualified person that can do fit testing and medical clearance, you might have an older worker who has heart and lung issues, and these things create a lot of stress on our cardiovascular system, and you could increase their risk as well. So summary, big picture. I talked about the big picture. Farming is a high-risk venture. It's not just confined spaces and manure, it's a whole bunch of other things. We need to work at the safety hierarchy, getting rid of the controllable hazards. It's greatly preferred. When we begin to step down on the safety hierarchy, risk levels change. And they can change very dramatically. Monitors have a place, but they are not a replacement for best practices. Like I wouldn't agitate on warm days in a no-wind situation with a crusted lagoon. It's just, we know from Becky's work, it's high hazard, high risk. And then again, monitors must be used properly. Training, proper use is an absolute must. So Becky, you got a comment, question?
I realize after we're saying all this, it's a ton of information. And the one thing I want to leave you with before you go down into, I mean, monitors are great, and I think we should explore all these. But the main picture I want to leave you with, and maybe we didn't say it explicitly, is reduce your risk, right? Check your hydrogen sulfide levels, or your sulfur levels in manure. Don't agitate on a no-wind, low-temperature day, right? There are key things you can look at that will reduce your risks. Don't go into a confined space without the proper gear and all of the training that goes along with it. Outside of a confined space, reduce your risk with those things. The other thing that reduces your risk is getting a monitoring system so that you understand when you might be in a high-risk situation, even though you've limited those other risks. When those monitors go off, right, and now I'm seeing low concentrations, they're not the ones that I think are toxic, you need to go back to eliminating the risk, right? If my thing is going off every day, you're going to start to ignore it, so you need to go back and reduce the reasons that's being produced in the first place, right? Whether it be changing the timing you agitate, changing how your diet of your cows or whatever, right? So have a strategy of how you're going to reduce your risk. And the last part I want to say is have a plan that all of your employees know, everybody at your farm knows, in case something goes wrong, right?
Yep.
Those are the big things that you should.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Thanks for that wrap up and summary. Yes, sir.
So if they're educating what's the trick in a low-risk situation, you reduce risk by placing a couple large barn fans around the pit?
Anything that increases your dispersion will reduce your risk, right? That's why we say even like in those underbarn situations, that's why we push a lot of ventilation in there, right? Increase the ventilation, you know, particularly for those kinds of designs, right? A naturally ventilated barn doesn't give you the opportunity to force more air through. So using some fans can increase dispersion. Is it enough? I can't tell you exactly what's enough, but if it's still, I would just delay until you feel enough wind. But barn fans are going to continue to reduce your risk by increasing that dispersion. But I don't want to give you the false sense that just because you've added a barn fan and if I have a huge monstrous pit, that might not be sufficient, right? But it could reduce your risk, right? So we understand all these practices reduce risk, but they're not a guarantee that the
or Becky, another way, none of them by itself is a single magic bullet. Right. Yeah. And we do have that fan recommendation on what we provided to the family back in the fall. But we were a little bit nervous about that. We said to make sure you're not pushing against the wind, because then you might have a net zero right there. So make sure you're pushing with the wind, and even with that, the monitoring still is probably even more important. Other comments, question? Yes, sir. I'm going to let Becky answer. How much does the humidity affect?
It's hard to pull without. So I would say we have some general information about what restricts dispersion or not. But individual parameters, I don't want you to start thinking certain conditions are going to cause differences. Like the rain could drop the temperature, which may have an increase.
Right.
The amount of humidity changes the amount of oxygen, like oxygen that can be held, right? So these all have impacts. A lot of them are tied together, so it's sometimes hard to pull out specifically one, and then they have confounding impacts. So the biggest ones we know are wind, right? So make sure the temperature, you don't want it to be, the manure to be super, the warmer the manure is, the more sulfur or hydrogen sulfide it's going to produce, and no wind is not going to allow dispersion. Right? So those are really the big things you should do.
Yeah, Becky, and that said, with Bob and Diane's farm situation, the relative humidity that morning was close to 100%. So the higher humidity is going to increase risk or add to the risk, but we don't know relative to like wind speed and temperature and things like that.
Generally, what we've seen with other gases and dispersion and things is that the wind is a bigger factor.
Yes.
That's why I keep pushing that one, that the wind, but a lot of times when we had no wind, then there's also a relative time, it's hard to pull out which one of those are doing that, but generally the wind has a bigger factor.
I guess this might, another way now is the amount of concentration, how fast it disperses faster with the amount of moisture in the air.
Yeah, and I
or
think
combined.
I think the impact of that is not great compared to
Relative to wind, right.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
It's hard to quantify.
And we are trying to do some research to better give you information on that, but it takes so many data points in all kinds of conditions, and I hope in a year or two we can say a little better, but even with all those data points, I don't know that we'll be able to get there. So at this point, when I've talked to the air quality engineers and the people who study like atmospheric sciences, all of these kinds of folks, they constantly say, be careful. You don't want to get anybody to get on the wrong track and just focus on wind is probably the biggest thing. And
Right.
any physical features that might reduce dispersion.
Hey, Becky, I want to add on one other thing you said too, and you did say it very clearly. I want to just make absolutely sure, because you've got that chart that shows at 55 degrees Fahrenheit, that number went way down, the ppm. And it's really important to know that that's not the, and I know you said this, not the air temperature, that's the slurry temperature itself.
The one thing I should have mentioned too, like that's one test at one sulfur level.
In one state at
There's
one,
all
yeah.
these other factors, right?
Yeah.
So maybe if I had more sulfur, all of those numbers are going to shift up quite a bit. So even though in that particular case, at that sulfur level in manure, it went down to
Yeah.
very low concentrations. If I had more sulfur because I was heating more or something, I might hit concentrations that are higher, right? So that's the key why you have to kind of target all of these things. What is my sulfur level? What is my wind? What kind of practices when I'm agitating, and then having some monitoring to clue you in if you're missing something, right?
I only throw it out there because the air temperature that morning again was around 55. But having been in the 80s the week before, that crusted manure basin was probably up in the 80-degree range, I'm guessing. It's like a nice solar cover on top of the basin. So you've got to be careful with that. Yes?
Have you, like after you pump all the liquid out, you got your solids left, have you took any gas readings off of just the solids when you're cleaning out, like eliminating the solids?
Yeah, we're trying to get some actual
I'm gonna,
measurements.
here, I'll give you the mic.
Those circumstances can produce high hydrogen sulfide levels, particularly because if you think about the storage now, now you're kind of almost in a confined space. The top is open, but you have now sidewalls, so the effect of wind may not be reaching down into there, so your dispersion is probably going to be less. And we've seen in situations like tankers, even when they're empty, we know the concentrations can be to a point where they're deadly, right? So it is a time that I would be extremely cautious. When I work with my own students, when we're sampling and doing things, I warn them constantly, there is when you're out there and you need to get something done, there's a temptation to walk down the ramp or something, right, to push or to do something. But those are times when I would definitely take the slower approach with a monitor and be sure that my levels are not going to be something that is going to be concerning.
Thanks. Oops. Yes?
Once manure is pushed into a pit, how long before it starts producing methane or anything?
Oh, yeah. Once it's pushed into a pit, how long till it begins to produce?
Immediately. It's just coming out of the animal, it's already producing, because even in the animal, it's producing those
Yeah.
gases, right? So, your cows are burping up tons of methane all the time. So even as it's excreted, it's instantaneous. And so you're getting some of that production even in the barn, but the volume is not large enough typically in a barn, and that you don't have those anaerobic conditions once it hits the floor that you do once you get into deep storage where now there's no oxygen penetration in there.
That's a really good question, and there's a lot of this I think we're just beginning to really look at. But yeah, Becky's exactly right. Maybe one more, and then we'll. Who are we going to turn it over to then?
So everybody's looking here, just watching, and seeing everybody gets scared of the prices on buying these monitors.
Yeah.
Well, there'll be people talking to me later this afternoon that we could rent the units. They
most,
speaking about this afternoon.
most times when you're
You wanna-
hauling your manure, you're doing it twice a year, and which is, for typical farmers, is maybe a week out of the year. So in order to own a monitor, it might not be feasible for you. So we were trying to find a cost-effective way of doing that, and our thought is kind of rentals, because you're gonna need more than just one monitor, because you're gonna have more than one person doing that, and each person should have their own monitor, in that situation.
We
So
just
we'll
want-
talk more about that this
Yeah, we
afternoon.
just don't want to scare everybody away that this is out of,
Yeah.
practical cost. So there are options out there that we can make it friendly for everybody to get their experience with them, and they don't have to have the major investment of the calibration equipment, right?
Because we do recommend that, our thought is we'd rather have you try a monitor out and rent it before purchasing it, so that you know what you're using it for, make sure it's working for your scenario before putting in a big investment.
That's a really great idea. Well, thank you guys all, and I'm going to turn it back over to Ken. Appreciate your attention this morning.
All right, thank you, John. Let's give John and Becky a big hand.